When you're designing a SaaS application, one of the early decisions you need to make is around how to model your authorization or your permissions logic inside of the system. What users can do what inside of which components inside of your product. And there's three models that you can consider at this point. The start off is the most simple, maybe the most obvious, which is access control lists or ACL. This is where you explicitly assign individual users to resources. So you would have a user would have a permission on a particular object, and you end up with a big old list of access controls for users to a particular object. This is the most obvious when you look at it from a code or a implementation perspective, but it creates this tight coupling between the users and the individual objects, and it struggles to deal with nested of those objects as well and using further conditions upon it. So going from that, having to deal with individual users, the next step up is RBAC or role-based access control. So rather than assigning individual users or individual identities to do actions on objects, you assign a role to those objects, and then users can be given those particular roles. So for example, you might have a manager role inside of your SaaS platform. A manager can do certain actions, and you assign that manager role to do certain actions on certain resources. And then what you do is you would give people that role. So in your directory, in your IDP, you would have a system where you have your user and you assign them different roles. And this works at kind of a medium scale, but the problem that runs into it is if you need more granularity in a role-based access control system, you end up having what's called role explosion. So you might start off with like a manager role, but then you might have to have a manager Europe or a manager US role. And then go even further down, you might have manager US Texas, or you might have manager Europe London, or you might have manager Europe London except this particular department. And you end up with this growing list of roles, and it's very hard to keep up with the assignments and keep up with what they will mean. And you essentially end up in the final state with more roles than you have users, or even roles with only a single user in it, at which point it's kind of pointless. So the final model, and the one that we certainly recommend, is ABAC or attribute-based access control. And this is where you are using information like what role someone has, along with further context about the user or the resource they're accessing. So you could have a manager role, but you could have further conditions or attribute checks based upon it. So you could say managers can edit this object, but you can add a further condition, an attribute check that says as long as the user's department is equal to the department that the object belongs to. So in the case of like an expenses tracking system, you might say the approve action on an expense is only allowed if you're a manager and your team is equal to finance, or the department that the expenses came from is equal to the department that the expense has been filed against. And these are finer grained authorization checks or conditions that you put on top of your logic to define as a policy to then enforce use permissions. So it avoids all the problems of explicitly assigning users with ACLs. It avoids the role explosion problem of role-based access control. And then attribute-based access control gives you that dynamicism inside of your policy without having to hard code this logic or hard code a role or hard code an ACL to do much more finer grained checks for whether action should be allowed or not.